Hey everyone, welcome to Insomnia Stories X, a place for those who can't sleep and those who wish they could. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're new here, subscribe and become part of the darkness with us. Turn off the lights, get comfortable. I took the ranger position at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. Not in the dramatic sense. No crime, no scandal. Just the slow suffocation of a life that no longer fit. 9 years working corporate logistics in Denver had hollowed me out, turned me into someone who attended meetings about meetings and smiled at people I didn't recognize in office hallways. When my marriage dissolved with the quiet inevitability of a fading radio signal, I realized I'd been running on empty for longer than I could remember. The position came through a contact from college, someone I'd barely kept in touch with. Ranger work, they said. Trail maintenance, visitor education, emergency response. The salary was modest. The housing was a cabin near the remote northern sector, far from the main tourist corridors. I applied at 2 in the morning, alone in my apartment. And they called back the next day. They needed someone who could work alone, who didn't mind the isolation. I was hired before the week ended. My name is Marcus Brennan. I'm telling you this story because you should know my credentials before you decide whether to believe what happened. I'm not the type of person who sees things. I don't have imagination to spare. Most of what I do requires precise measurement and documentation. That's what makes the events of last autumn so difficult to reconcile with the version of myself I'd carefully constructed. The cabin was a mile from Gunsight Lake, accessible by a service road that became increasingly overgrown as seasons passed. The structure itself was built in the 1970s, solid enough but showing its age, patched roof, a generator that coughed like a sick animal, windows that rattled with any serious wind. Behind it the forest rose in tiers of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, the canopy so dense that full darkness came by 6 o'clock even in late August. I arrived in mid-August. The superintendent gave me a tour, a radio, and a list of protocols. The nearest town was 50 miles south. Grizzly bears in the high country, occasional wildfires, lost hikers, though fewer than you'd expect. Most people stick to the main trails. The superintendent mentioned it almost casually. If I radioed emergency services, response time could be 3 to 4 hours, depending on conditions. That was just how it was out here. I told myself I liked that. The solitude felt like permission to stop pretending. The work itself was straightforward. I maintained trails, checked on backcountry shelters, recorded wildlife observations, educated the handful of campers who ventured beyond the main parks. In those first weeks, I fell into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Wake before dawn, coffee on the camp stove, radio check-in with the main station, hours of walking through forest that still held the green intensity of late summer. By September, I understood what people meant when they talked about the restorative power of wilderness. The tightness in my chest had loosened. I slept without the anxiety dreams that had plagued me for years. The cabin, despite its age and creaks, became a refuge rather than a confinement. That's when I began noticing the deer. They appeared in the meadow behind the cabin, usually in late afternoon. Nothing remarkable. Mule deer, common throughout the park. A doe and twin fawns, to be precise. I started watching them from the cabin window as I made dinner, finding something oddly centering about their calm grazing. They would emerge from the tree line just as the light took on that golden thickness, spend an hour among the grass, then disappear back into the forest. I logged them in my observation notebook, noting time and behavior. That was the job, after all. Document everything. Look for patterns. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday in mid-September. I was repairing a damaged section of fence near the lake access trail when I found the site. The clearing was about a quarter-mile from my cabin, hidden from the trail by a thick stand of younger trees. There was blood there, considerable blood, matted into the grass in an irregular pattern, and the carcass, or what remained of it. I've seen predator kills before. In the weeks after arriving, I'd found the remains of elk that had fallen to wolves, the neat consumption patterns of bears, the scattered feathers of a mountain lion's bird meal. What I found in that clearing didn't fit any predation pattern I recognized. The animal was a deer, a mule deer doe. It was nearly intact, which was the unsettling part. The body lay in a twisted posture, the spine curved in a way that suggested violent breakage. Its eyes were open, filmy, and reflecting the overcast sky. But what struck me most was the shape of the wound on its flank. It was too deliberate, too geometric, a long gash that appeared to have been made from the inside out. I documented everything: photographs, GPS coordinates, detailed notes. Then I radioed the wildlife station and reported a possible predator kill. They said to check back in a week, see if the carcass attracted other activity, standard procedure, but I couldn't shake the image. That wound. The unnatural curve of the spine. I'd studied animal biology, knew what I should be seeing. This didn't match. The doe and fawns appeared in the meadow 3 nights later. I watched them through the cabin window as I ate dinner, watching their movements as they grazed. The doe looked normal, healthy. The fawns were small, lean. They fed for about 40 minutes, then turned together toward the tree line. What happened next lodged itself in my memory, with a clarity I wish I could forget. The doe walked toward the forest. The fawns followed. Halfway there, the doe's gait shifted. It wasn't a stumble. It was more like the animal was reorganizing itself mid-stride. Its back legs seemed to lose coordination. It stopped, motionless, for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it bolted, not the elegant bounding jump of a startled deer. This was something else, a desperate, loping run that seemed to focus more on speed than grace. The fawns followed, panicked by the mother's sudden panic. Within seconds, they'd vanished into the dark beneath the trees. I sat at my table, fork halfway to my mouth, wondering if stress was finally catching up with me, if the isolation was starting to show. You can run from human connection only so far before the emptiness starts generating phantoms, but I had seen it. The doe's movement had been fundamentally wrong. I didn't write that in the observation log. October arrived with an early snow that surprised everyone. By the 3rd week, the high passes were already closing, rangers pulling back from the highest elevations. The main park services began scaling down for winter, though the northern sector never truly closed. A skeleton crew stayed year-round for emergency response and winter maintenance. I was the permanent fixture in my district, the baseline against which seasonal rangers would later check in. The isolation deepened. I saw other rangers once a week when supply runs came through. Otherwise, the forest was my only company. The deer visits continued, but with a frequency that seemed to increase. Not just the doe and fawns, but other animals. A small herd of elk that moved with an unsettling uniformity. A black bear, far too late in the season to still be active. Twice I saw mountain lions at the meadow's edge, watching the other animals with an intensity that suggested hunger, though they never advanced. And always they moved wrong. Not every time, but often enough that I stopped trying to rationalize it. A stiffness in the hindquarters, a jerking head motion that seemed to require effort, movement patterns that suggested the animal was operating its limbs like controls in a system it hadn't quite mastered. I documented none of it in official channels. I told myself I was being selective about which observations warranted reporting, but the truth was simpler. I knew how this would sound. Ranger isolated in wilderness reports animals moving wrong. Psychological evaluation recommended. In mid-October, I discovered the second site. This time, the kill was closer to the cabin, just beyond the clearing where I kept my firewood stacked. I found it while gathering wood one afternoon, a elk calf that couldn't have been more than a month old. The body was partially decomposed, suggesting it had been there for days, but not so long that the structure had completely broken down. The wound pattern was identical to the deer, a long gash torn from inside out, precise enough that it suggested intention. What made it worse was the position. The calf lay near the edge of my cleared area, as though it had stumbled from the forest and collapsed just short of reaching some imagined sanctuary. I moved the carcass away from the cabin, wrapped it in tarps, and buried it in a pit I dug near the property line. The work kept me occupied for hours, kept my mind focused on the immediate and physical, rather than the questions starting to form. That night, I sat on the cabin's porch with the rifle I kept for bear protection and watched the meadow. The sun set around 5:30 now, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. Stars emerged, the temperature dropped to near freezing, and my breath came in visible clouds. At 9 o'clock, I heard the first sound. It was a call, something between the mew of a fawn and the whistle of an elk bull in rut. The noise came from the forest to the east, maybe 200 yards away, though sound travels strangely in cold, thin air. I pressed the rifle closer, finger off the trigger but positioned where it could reach quickly. The call repeated, then again from a different vector, as though the sound was being made from two locations simultaneously. I'd never heard anything quite like it. Deer don't vocalize that way. Elk can, but the tonal quality was wrong. I went inside and locked the door. The calls continued through the night, sporadic but persistent. 3 times I opened the door to look, seeing nothing but the pale meadow under starlight. The 4th time, I saw the doe. She stood at the far edge of the meadow, silhouetted against the lighter sky, just stood there motionless, facing the cabin. I could feel her attention, though that's impossible. Animals don't focus in ways humans interpret as intention. I raised the rifle. She didn't move. I lowered it without firing. What would I even report? A deer in a meadow, acting weird but not threatening? She stood there for maybe 2 minutes, then walked into the forest with movements that looked almost normal. Almost. The calls ceased after that. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noises that had preceded it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and documentation, rereading my observation logs, searching for entries that might explain what I was witnessing. Environmental stress could account for behavioral changes, illness in the wildlife population, interference from new predators moving into the territory, but none of these explanations sat right. Something about the wrongness of the movements, the deliberate quality of the wounds, the orchestrated nature of the visits. It all suggested intention in a way that contradicted my understanding of wildlife behavior. I radioed the main station in the morning and reported general wildlife activity, nothing specific. The response was casual. They were seeing unusual patterns throughout the park, probably related to the early winter. Bears acting aggressive, herds scattering, normal stress responses. I didn't mention the calls. I didn't mention the doe's stance or the geometric wounds. I was protecting myself from the suspicion I could see forming on the other end of that radio, the quiet concern that comes before someone suggests you're not cut out for the isolation. By late October, the snow had deepened to 1.5 feet on the level ground. The service road became impassable, and I shifted to snowmobiling or hiking for resupply. The cabin warmed with a wood-burning stove, and I found myself spending more time inside, watching the forest through windows rather than walking through it. The doe continued to visit, always in the late afternoon as the light faded, always with the same sequence: emerge from the eastern tree line, walk to approximately the center of the meadow, stand still for a period that stretched anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes, then retreat. The fawns, I noticed, were no longer with her. She came alone. On one particularly clear afternoon, I watched her through binoculars. Her body was in good condition, weight and fur appearing healthy, but her eyes, at this distance I could see them more clearly, seemed to reflect light differently than any deer's eyes should. Not the amber or dark brown of normal mule deer. There was something almost metallic about the reflection. I marked the date in my log, October 28th, noted the behavior, and then, finally, I wrote something I'd been avoiding. Behavioral patterns suggest the animal may be sick or injured in ways that are neurologically manifested. It was a neutral way of saying the animal was wrong. The first serious storm of the season arrived on November 2nd. It came from the northwest, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow in 18 hours. The wind was brutal, driven hard enough to create drifts that buried half the cabin's south side. I spent the storm inside, listening to the wood stove pop and hiss, watching the visibility drop until the forest beyond the windows became an undifferentiated gray. When the storm cleared the next morning, the world had transformed. The road was impassable. The trails were buried. I was effectively sealed in, and the supply run that was scheduled for the 4th wouldn't happen until the storm finished moving through. I should have been concerned. People in isolation during early winter need to manage resources carefully. But I found the closure oddly satisfying. No need to maintain contact with the main station, to answer casual questions about condition and morale. Just me and the cabin and the forest under snow. The doe didn't appear for 3 days. The meadow remained pristine, unmarked except for the occasional set of tracks from birds or rabbits. The absence felt almost worse than the presence. I found myself checking the meadow obsessively, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. On the 4th day, November 6th, I found new tracks leading away from the cabin. They were large, the size of a human handprint pressed into the snow. 5 digits spread wide, with a depth and pressure pattern that suggested something heavy pushing down with deliberate force. The tracks formed a trail that led from the north side of the cabin toward the forest, then curved back around toward the south. I circled the entire cabin following the trail. There were dozens of prints, intersecting and overlapping, creating a pattern that suggested the thing, whatever had made them, had circled my home multiple times while I was inside. The tracks weren't from any animal I could identify, not bear despite the size, not human despite the hand-like quality. The pattern suggested something walking on either 2 or 4 legs, shifting between gaits as it moved. I photographed everything and traced the trails on my map. They led from the woods northwest of the cabin, circled the structure, and disappeared back into the forest to the south. The trail was most concentrated on the east side of the cabin, the side that faced the meadow. That afternoon I found the second prey site. This one was less than 100 yards from the cabin, nearly at the boundary of my cleared land. The carcass was an elk, a young bull, its antlers just beginning to reach their mature form. It was fresh, probably killed within the past 24 hours. The wound pattern was the same, a long gash that appeared to originate from inside the body. But this time there was something else. Tracks surrounded the body, the same hand-like prints I'd found circling the cabin, now arranged in a pattern around the kill. They suggested the thing had spent time there after the elk died, moving around the body in what looked almost like a systematic investigation. I sat in the snow for perhaps 15 minutes, staring at the arrangement of prints and blood and death. The temperature was dropping as the afternoon advanced. My legs were going numb. Then I heard the sound from the meadow. It was the doe. She stood at the meadow's edge, and she was making that horrible vocalization, that twisted cross between a fawn's cry and something else. The sound went on, echoing across the snow. I could see her body heaving with the effort of producing it. I grabbed the rifle and ran toward her, shouting as I came, "Get out! Go!" She bolted at my approach, bounding toward the forest with an awkward gait that showed her hindquarters weren't functioning correctly. As she reached the tree line, I saw her back leg catch wrong, saw her nearly stumble before she crashed into the brush and vanished. I stood in the snow, rifle raised, breathing hard. The forest around the meadow's edge had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I went back and finished burying the elk. That night I radioed the main station and told them I needed supply and equipment checks due to unusual animal activity in the area. I didn't mention the tracks. I didn't mention the doe or the calls or anything that would sound like paranoia. Just framework, increased predation, possible disease vectors, need for outside verification of park conditions. The response was professional but distant. A ranger would come through in a few days once the roads cleared. Until then, standard protocols. Keep an inventory of food and fuel. Monitor weather. Use the bear protocol if needed. The radio crackled. "How are you doing otherwise, Brennan? You sound stressed." I said I was fine. Just the isolation and early winter getting to me. "That passes," the dispatcher said. "You'll adjust." But I didn't think I would. Not with those tracks circling my cabin. Not with the certainty that something was out there, that it was interested in the cabin, and that it was leaving bodies like a message I was supposed to understand. I spent that night with all the lights on, the door locked, and the rifle within arm's reach. I didn't see or hear anything, but I felt the presence anyway. the weight of attention from somewhere in the dark forest. In my earlier years, before the corporate life hollowed me out, I might have called it intuition. Now I recognized it as something simpler, the awareness of an animal that senses it's being hunted. The ranger who arrived on November 9th was a man named Clayton, probably in his early 30s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life at altitude. He came on a snowmobile, checked on the cabin and perimeter, and asked me what I'd been seeing. I showed him the kill sites, though the carcasses were frozen solid by now and didn't reveal much beyond what he could already infer from the scarring. I didn't show him the tracks. The snow had been disturbed by new storms and my own movements. Predator activity, he said, examining the closest body. Probably a lion or pack of wolves. Been some reports of unusual behavior, but nothing that's raised serious flags. The kill patterns, I said. They look internal trauma, deliberate. He looked at me then, and I saw the calculation happen in his eyes. This was the moment where he decided whether I was a competent ranger noting unusual details, or a man cracking under isolation. Could be feeding behavior you're not familiar with, he said carefully. Some predators have techniques. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with the wildlife beyond normal winter stress. I knew better than to push. The assessment had already been made. Ranger's judgment is sound but influenced by isolation factors. Monitor and report regularly. He spent the night and left the next morning, taking my update to the main station. Everything checked out structurally. I had sufficient supplies. The radio was functioning. I should contact them if anything changed. After he left, I felt oddly alone. The presence I'd been sensing before seemed to intensify, as though the thing outside had been waiting for external contact to be severed. It was a feeling without logic, but feelings are sometimes more reliable than logic. The doe stopped appearing in the meadow. 10 days passed with no sightings. The forest seemed almost dormant, as though the whole ecosystem had drawn into itself, waiting for something. I maintained my routines, checking trails that went nowhere near the deep forest, maintaining the cabin, cataloging supplies. I avoided the area beyond the cleared land. On November 19th, I found the third site. It was different from the others. This wasn't a predator kill. There was a location about 3 miles from the cabin, a winter shelter that served as a way station for rangers doing extended patrols. I made it a point to check it regularly, keep it stocked for emergencies. When I opened the door, I found blood on the floor. It wasn't fresh, maybe 3 to 4 days old, but enough to suggest something had been wounded or dying inside the shelter. I checked for human remains. There was nothing. No body, no serious injury evidence, just the blood and, oddly, sets of muddy hand-like tracks on the floor. That changed things. This suggested that whatever was making those tracks was operating with enough intelligence to seek shelter, to recognize a structure as a place that might provide refuge or rest. It was tracking with purpose, not random predation. I cleaned the shelter, documented the evidence, and radioed the main station with a sanitized report. I'd found evidence of an animal seeking shelter, possibly injured. They should send a ranger to do a full inspection. The response was automatic. They'd send someone when conditions allowed. In the meantime, I should secure the shelter and avoid that area. I did secure it. I also didn't avoid the area. I went back 2 days later and found more tracks leading from the shelter toward the deep forest to the east. These tracks had a pattern of movement that suggested searching, back and forth along a line, as though something was hunting. On November 26th, I finally saw it clearly. It was late afternoon, the light already fading. I'd gone out to check a section of trail to the north, the one that led toward Gunsight Lake. The snow was melting slightly in the afternoon warmth, creating a granular crust that crackled under my snowshoes. I was about a mile from the cabin when I heard it. Not the calls this time. Actual movement, something large moving through the forest to my left. I stopped and turned toward the sound. At first I saw only the forest, dark beneath the tree canopy, the shapes of pines and firs rising up toward a sky that was fading from gray to purple. Then something shifted in the shadows between 2 trees about 60 yards away. The deer stood there, the doe, the one I'd been watching. but she wasn't moving like a deer now. Her front legs bent in an unnatural way, folding and unfolding as she shifted her weight. Her back legs dragged slightly, making no contribution to her movement. Her head twisted toward me with a rotation that went too far, her spine bending in ways that should have broken something. And her eyes, those eyes that had caught the light metallic, were now fixed on me with a quality of attention that my mind couldn't quite process. It was too focused, too aware. She made a sound, not the vocalization from before. This was different, a wet, grinding noise, as if something in her throat was working to shape air into meaning. "Brennan," the sound almost said. "Brennan," or something close to it, a mockery of the shape my name makes. I stumbled backward. The rifle was in my hands, but I didn't raise it. In that moment, I understood that guns wouldn't matter, that this thing wasn't a threat in the way I could defend against. The doe, the thing wearing the doe's body, took a step toward me. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, a body learning how to operate the muscles and joints of an animal it wasn't built to control. I ran. I didn't think about it. Thinking would have slowed me down. I ran through the snow and back toward the cabin, my snowshoes catching and releasing, my breath coming in sobs. Behind me I could hear movement, not following directly but moving parallel to my path, as though cutting off angles, hurting me. I made it to the cabin and locked the door. I don't remember the last part clearly, just that I was outside and then I was inside, and the door was locked, and I was moving the heavy wooden table in front of it. The thing arrived 10 minutes later. It didn't try to break down the door. It walked around the cabin, the same circling pattern I'd detected in the tracks. I could hear the sound of its movement, feet and possibly hands on the ground, the awful grinding noise of its attempt at vocalization, occasionally the sound of what might have been its body hitting the cabin's exterior. It stayed for 4 hours. I sat with the rifle, watching each window in sequence, never allowing my attention to rest for more than 30 seconds on any one direction. The light faded entirely. Night came down like a closing hand. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The sound ceased. The presence withdrew. I spent the night with every light on, the fire burning hot enough to warm the cabin to uncomfortable temperatures, and the rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep. I didn't try. At first light, I found the tracks. They led from the forest to the cabin, circled it thoroughly, and then led back away toward the deep forest to the east. The hand-like prints were interspersed with hoof prints, the two movement types overlapping in a pattern that suggested the thing was cycling between upright and quadrupedal locomotion. I radioed the main station at dawn and asked for immediate evacuation. I didn't explain. The dispatcher pushed back gently. This was wilderness living, stress manifesting as anxiety, nothing that required evacuation. They'd send a ranger in a few days to check on me. I said I couldn't wait days. I said there was a safety issue. What kind of safety issue? The dispatcher's voice had changed. Now it carried the careful tone of someone assessing danger to personnel. Predator activity near the cabin, large animal, exhibiting unusual aggression. I need someone out here today. There was a pause. Probably them checking weather conditions, staffing availability, logistics. We can have someone to you by late afternoon. Can you secure yourself until then? I said yes, I can secure myself. But I was already moving by that point. I packed what I could carry. Water, high-calorie food, the rifle, ammunition, my radio and phone. I locked the cabin and hiked away from it, taking the trail that led north toward Gunsight Lake. The lake was partially frozen, the surface a patchwork of ice and open water. The afternoon sun had warmed the air enough to prevent new freezing. I found the ranger's shelter on the northern shore, the same place I'd found the blood days earlier. I locked myself inside and waited. The ranger, a woman named Sylvia, arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She was efficient, professional, more concerned with wildlife incident documentation than my apparent distress. She took my report, photographed the tracks I showed her, made notes about the kill sites. Predator activity this far north is unusual but not unprecedented, she said, reviewing her notes. But you're right to request support. We'll coordinate with wildlife management. You'll probably be relocated temporarily while they assess the situation. I asked if I could leave immediately. She said the roads were mostly clear now, but it was better to wait until morning and travel in daylight. She'd sleep at the cabin, make sure everything was secure. I'm not going back to the cabin, I said. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. I could see her deciding something. Okay, she said carefully. Let's pack what you need, lock everything down, and you can come with me. We'll head to the ranger station tonight. We left Gunsight Lake as the sun was touching the western peaks, throwing long shadows across the snow. Sylvia drove the ranger truck. I sat in the passenger seat and tried to explain what I'd experienced without sounding like someone whose isolation had triggered a psychological break. She listened. She didn't agree or disagree. When we reached the main station, she filed a report and offered me accommodations at the ranger dormitory. I stayed for 3 days. They interviewed me, checked medical records, sent a wildlife management team to investigate the sites I'd documented. The official conclusion: unusual predator activity, possibly a diseased animal or recent territory displacement. The tracks were large canine, probably a young cougar or possibly a wolf that had migrated farther south than expected. The kills showed predator characteristics, though the wounding patterns were unusual. They also made an observation. The deer carcass I'd buried near the cabin showed signs of chronic neurological disease, likely CWD, chronic wasting disease, a prion infection that affects the nervous system. This could account for the unusual behavior I'd witnessed. The doe had been sick, dying. The other animals had probably been stressed by her presence, manifesting behavioral abnormalities as a response to that stress. As for my own experience, the encounter in the woods, it was almost certainly a moment of high-stress perception where normal animal behavior had been filtered through anxiety and interpreted as threatening. They didn't need me to stay. Ranger stations are temporary assignments. Isolation work is cyclical. I could hand off the cabin to whoever wanted the winter posting. I said I didn't think anyone else should go there. They noted my concern, but indicated the posting was vital to park operations. Someone would be assigned in the spring, when weather allowed for proper transition. I left Glacier National Park on November 29th and never returned. The official report filed by the Park Service indicated that unusual predator activity and animal disease vectors explained the situation. Wildlife management increased patrols in the area. No further significant incidents were reported that winter, but I kept reading the reports. I kept track of Glacier's official wildlife documentation. And 5 months later, I found what I was looking for. In late April, a ranger named Gerald Hatch went to the northern sector to prepare the cabin for seasonal operation. He was found 3 days later by search and rescue, approximately 2 miles from the cabin, in a state of severe psychological crisis. He was ranting about animals that moved wrong, about tracks that encircled his shelter, about a sound like his own voice calling from the forest. They brought him out by helicopter. He spent 8 months in a facility being evaluated for acute stress disorder and possible psychotic break. His last documented report was from January of the following year. He was still institutionalized, still talking about the things that moved incorrectly, still insisting that something in the park had learned to mimic human speech. I read that report in a motel room in Albuquerque, where I'd relocated to work logistics for a shipping company. The pay was worse than corporate work. The environment was less demanding. I don't use my imagination anymore. I don't look for patterns. I accept what I see without trying to understand the reason behind it. But sometimes, particularly when the light is fading and the sky goes purple, I think about the doe standing in the forest, about the way it twisted its head, about the grinding sound it made when it tried to shape my name. I think about the hand-like prints circling my cabin, the way they moved from surface to surface, learning the structure, understanding it, and I wonder what else might be out there, hidden in the deep forest, beyond Gunsight Lake, learning how to inhabit the bodies of the animals it kills, learning how to vocalize, learning what sounds might bring another human being back to check on the cabin, back to the place where it practices its new skills. I've never mentioned the doe's eyes, the way they caught the light wrong, as though something was reflecting from behind them, as though something was looking out through the animal's skull. operating the body like a system it was still figuring out how to master. I took the job because I needed to disappear. I got what I asked for. The only question that keeps me awake some nights is, what was out there, really? Not what the Park Service concluded. Not what makes sense within the framework of animal biology and disease vectors. What was actually looking back at me from inside that dead deer's eyes? I don't think I want to know the answer. I think that knowledge is the kind that doesn't stay contained. It spreads like the cold does at altitude, like the isolation does when it has enough time to root into your thinking. Some things are better left undocumented. My name is Kaynor Vess, and I've been the sole ranger at Stone Lake Station in Glacier National Park for 14 months. People ask why someone with my background would take an isolated posting in the Northern Cascades, away from civilization, away from the comfort of regular patrols and ranger stations with more than one person. The honest answer involves something I can't fully explain. I worked for 7 years as a lead ranger out of the main Glacier headquarters. Good work, clean record, commendations. But in the last 2 years, something shifted. I became aware of absences in the reports, gaps in the patrol logs that didn't align, missing hikers that were classified as voluntary departures, inconsistencies in the official documentation about certain areas of the Northern Territory that never quite added up. I started asking questions. My supervisor, Garrett Mills, suggested I might be overthinking things, that wilderness management involved judgment calls, that not every disappearance was a search and rescue operation, that some people came to the park seeking to disappear. I couldn't accept that answer. Stone Lake Station became available. Remote doesn't adequately describe it. The cabin sits 14 miles from the nearest maintained trailhead, accessible only by a weather-dependent service road in summer and foot traffic the rest of the year. The lake sits at 7,200 feet elevation, surrounded by dense lodgepole and whitebark pine. The nearest neighbor is Ranger Torres at Gunsight Pass Station, approximately 21 miles southeast across terrain that takes 6 hours to cross on foot. I volunteered for the assignment specifically because of those missing reports. The disappearances clustered in this region, in the higher elevations around Stone Lake and the northern approaches. If something was happening here, I wanted to be close enough to document it properly. The official reason I accepted was career development. The solitude, the responsibility of managing a remote sector independently, the opportunity to conduct original research on trail degradation and wildlife movement patterns. All of that was true, just not the full truth. I arrived in late April when the snow was still melting in patches. The cabin was smaller than I expected, built in 1987 with a recent roof replacement. Wood stove for heat, propane for cooking, a large rainwater collection system, no electricity except what the solar panels provided, which wasn't much in the winter months. Radio communication with the main station twice daily, required by protocol. The first 2 months were routine. I cleared trails, documented wildlife sightings, maintained the cabin's infrastructure. I found nothing unusual in the files or reports that had been forwarded to the station, nothing that confirmed my suspicions. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the inconsistencies, if Garrett was right about my overthinking. Then in late June I discovered the photographs. They were in a metal box buried beneath the floorboards of the cabin's back bedroom. Not recent. The prints were faded, the dates stamped on the back ranging from 1994 to 2003. I should have reported them immediately. I didn't. There were 37 photographs. Most showed the lake at different seasons, the surrounding ridges, the trail systems, normal ranger documentation. But 12 of them showed something else. They depicted evidence of habitation that wasn't marked on any official map, a structure of logs built into the mountainside about 2 miles northeast of the station, partially obscured by vegetation. The photos showed it at different stages, as if someone was documenting its construction and modification over time. The final image, dated September 2001, showed the structure with its roof completed, windows cut into the walls. On the back of that final photograph, in faded pencil, "Moved to Blacktail, safer for her, do not return." The photographs were signed with initials, GM, The same initials as Garrett Mills, though he couldn't have been the ranger here in 2001. Unless he was. I checked the staffing records. He had been. Garrett Mills was the ranger at Stone Lake Station from 1998 to 2003. He'd left the position without explanation and been reassigned to the main headquarters. The transition was documented but unremarkable in the official files. No note about why he'd left, what prompted the transfer, nothing about his time here. I should have made a call to the main station. Instead, I spent the next week following the photograph's directions, trying to locate the structure. It took me 4 days of careful navigation to find it. The building was still there. It wasn't as large as the photographs suggested, perhaps 15 feet by 20, built with care into a natural alcove on the mountainside. The logs had aged to a dark gray. The roof had partially collapsed. The windows were still there, though the glass had long since broken. Fragments of it glinted in the underbrush. The interior was empty except for rotted furniture and debris. The floor was packed earth, nearly covered by decades of pine needles. I found no evidence of who had lived there or why. No personal items, no written documents, nothing that explained the structure's purpose. What I did find was strange in a way that made my professional training feel inadequate. The walls bore marks, not scratches or damage from weather. These were deliberate, carved into the wood, hundreds of them, covering nearly every surface in the interior. They looked like tallies, but they weren't arranged in standard counting patterns. They formed shapes, almost like symbols, though I couldn't identify any meaning in them. Some of the marks appeared fresh, not recent. The exposed wood had weathered to gray, but recent in the context of the structure's overall age, perhaps 10 to 15 years old. Someone had been here, modifying and adding to these marks. Sometime in the 2010s, I took detailed photographs and measurements. I documented the structure's location with my GPS unit. I marked its position on my topographic maps, and I told no one. August brought cooler nights and the realization that my isolation was beginning to affect my judgment. I recognized this clinically, the way a doctor might recognize their own symptoms. But recognition didn't change the fact of it. The sounds started in the second week of August. They came from the direction of the abandoned structure, carried through the valley on the evening wind. Not animal sounds. I'd spent enough time in wilderness to know the calls of elk, the low rumble of bears, the yips of coyotes. These were different. They sounded like voices, not words, not anything that formed language I could understand, but distinctly vocal, distinctly human in their basic mechanics. They rose and fell with a cadence that suggested meaning, like someone calling across the distance wanting to be heard. They occurred between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. most nights. I would wake to them, lie in bed listening, trying to determine their exact origin. The geography of the valley distorted the sound, bounced it off the ridges and water. It could have come from 2 miles away or from just outside the cabin. On August 14th, I heard my own voice calling from the darkness. I was sitting at the cabin table documenting weather readings when I heard it. My name. Spoken in a voice that matched mine so precisely I initially believed my radio had malfunctioned and was broadcasting back to me. I rushed to the radio. It was off. The batteries had been removed and sat on the shelf beside the unit, just as I'd left them. Canor, again. My voice, unmistakably coming from somewhere across the lake. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The night was clear, the stars bright enough to cast shadows. The lake was still. I called back, not to the thing mimicking me, but to confirm my own location, to ground myself. My voice sounded small, real, distinctly different from the echo I'd heard. For 30 minutes I stood on the porch listening. The voice didn't repeat. Eventually I went back inside and locked the door, though I knew a locked door meant nothing if something determined wanted in. I made the radio contact with the main station the next morning. I reported the sound disturbances but explained them as possible audio equipment malfunction. I didn't mention hearing my own voice. Garrett would have flagged me as unstable, reassigned me, discounted anything I might have learned about the structure or the photographs or the missing hikers. The sounds continued every night for the rest of August. They became familiar in the way that any terror becomes familiar through repetition. The human mind adapts to threats. Fear, if sustained long enough, transforms into something closer to acceptance. But the sounds were evolving. By late August, they had begun to incorporate actual words. My name continued, but also other names, spoken in voices that matched ranger personnel I knew. Garrett's voice, sometimes calm and sometimes urgent. Torres's voice, calling from the darkness. Voices of hikers I'd encountered on trails. People I'd spoken to briefly and then forgotten. The thing was learning language. It was practicing how we sounded. The morning of September 3rd was the first day in 3 weeks that no sounds came in the night. I woke feeling almost refreshed, believing for a moment that whatever auditory disturbance had been plaguing me had resolved. The silence felt like grace. That afternoon, while I was repairing a section of the dock, I saw movement on the northern trail. A figure emerged from the tree line carrying a backpack. The distance was too great for detail, but the silhouette was clearly human. Not a typical hiker behavior. The season was late for backcountry work, and the trail from the nearest access point took most of a day to traverse. I watched the figure approach. It moved with a purposeful gait, not struggling with the terrain the way most unprepared hikers did. The person seemed to navigate the rocky ground effortlessly, taking a direct path rather than following the marked trail. As they drew closer, I could make out features. A man, perhaps in his 50s, wearing Ranger-issue khaki and a green parka. His face was difficult to read in the afternoon light. Something about his proportions seemed slightly off, but I attributed this to distance and the haze of altitude. "Station Chief?" the figure called. His voice was Garrett's voice. Exactly. I stood up from the dock and didn't move. Every instinct trained into me from years of wilderness work was sending warnings. This wasn't possible. Garrett was at the main headquarters. I'd seen the staffing schedule yesterday in my routine communications. I was in the area, the figure continued, now close enough that I could see his face clearly. It was Garrett's face. Not a perfect match. The skin had a quality that I struggled to describe, something between wax and leather, but close enough that at a distance, a person wouldn't question it. The radio weather forecast showed a front coming in. Thought you might need supplies. I stepped backward off the dock into the water. It was ankle-deep near the structure, cold enough to shock my system into clarity. "Garrett's at the main station," I said. "I confirmed it this morning." The thing's face shifted. A subtle movement, like muscles rearranging under the skin. "I came to warn you," it said, now in a voice that was almost Garrett's but not quite. The rhythm was off. "The structure in the northeast quadrant. You found it." There was no way it could know that unless it had been watching me. Which it had. Of course it had. "Go back toward the trees," I said, trying to remember protocol for confrontations with unknown individuals. There was no protocol for this. "The old ranger who built it found something," the thing continued. Its Garrett face was animated, expressive, trying so hard to seem human that the effort became monstrous. "Found something in the rocks beneath the old lodge site. Something that called. That voice you've been hearing at night. It's been calling for longer than there have been rangers here." I moved further into the lake, water now to my thighs. The cold was becoming painful, but it was real. It was something I could feel and understand and respond to with normal human physiology. "You can't reach it by walking," the thing said. "You can't escape it by running." The only option Garrett found was to build a structure where it could focus, to concentrate its attention on one point instead of allowing it to wander. But now someone's found the structure. "What are you?" I asked. The thing was silent for a moment. Its Garrett face went neutral, a blank expression that no actual human could maintain without appearing plastic. "I'm what calls," it said finally. "I'm what wants to be heard. Your voice helps me. Everyone's voice helps me. If I can sound like you, I can become you, and then I don't have to call from the woods anymore. Then I can live in the lodge." It stepped into the water behind me, moving with the slow, deliberate motion of something still learning how human bodies worked. "The structure is failing," it said, still in that almost Garrett voice. "Wood rots. Symbols fade." The old ranger knew this. He moved away before the structure failed. "But you found it. You documented it." Now the attention is shifting back toward the lake, toward the station, Toward you, I was shaking now, from cold or adrenaline or both. I waded deeper, toward the center of the lake, where the bottom dropped away. How do I stop it? I called back. You don't, the Garrett thing said. It had stopped at the water's edge. Its face was drifting again, features becoming less defined, more abstract. You accept it. You build a better structure, or you leave and let it move on to whoever comes next. The ranger before you lasted 4 years, the one before that, 8 months. Garrett lasted 5 years. That's the longest anyone's managed. The thing turned and walked back toward the tree line. Before it disappeared into the forest, it called out once more, using my voice now perfectly. Welcome to Stone Lake, Kaner. Welcome to where the voices live. I made it back to the cabin after dark, water dripping from my clothes, my body numb. I didn't attempt to radio the main station. I didn't file a report. I did what Garrett had done. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing the location. I found the abandoned structure based on the photographs. I began reinforcing it, replacing rotted wood, strengthening the walls. I studied the symbols carved into the interior, and I added to them new marks, new shapes, patterns designed to focus and contain the attention of whatever lived in the rocks beneath the mountain. I wasn't trying to trap it. I understood from the Garrett thing's explanation that trapping was impossible. I was trying to give it a place to concentrate, a point of focus so that its attention wouldn't fragment and wander toward the station, toward me, toward the broader wilderness where hikers might stumble into its notice. The sounds diminished as I worked. The voices calling in the night became fainter, more distant. By the time I completed the reinforcement of the structure's roof in late September, the nightly calls had stopped entirely. I returned to the station and submitted a request for transfer. The response took a week. Garrett approved it immediately. The official reason was personal reasons. No investigation, no questions. I left on October 12th, flying out on the supply helicopter, not looking back at the lake or the mountains or the structure in the northeast quadrant. I work now in the visitor center at the main glacier headquarters. The visitors ask me questions about the park, the trails, the wildlife. I answer them carefully. I discourage late-season backcountry permits in the northern sectors. I suggest alternative routes. I avoid discussing Stone Lake Station. Sometimes I receive communications from Stone Lake Station. The current ranger is named Victor Ashford. He's been there for 3 months. His reports are professional and unremarkable. I've noticed a recent notation about new wildlife movement patterns in the northern region. Nothing alarming. Ranger Torres responded with suggestions for monitoring protocols. I know what's happening. I know that the structure I reinforced is already beginning to degrade again. I know that within a few years the pattern will repeat. Ashford will hear the voices. He'll find the photographs that I've left carefully hidden in the same metal box. He'll discover the structure and the symbols. He'll make the decision that Garrett made, that I made. The hiking season begins again in a few months. More people will come to the park seeking wilderness, seeking escape, seeking transformation. Most will find nothing but beautiful scenery and sore feet. Some will go missing. They'll be classified as voluntary departures, their disappearances absorbed into the general statistics of backpacking risk. The lodge where the first rangers built their stations sat on a location with something beneath it, something that responds to sound, to voices, to human presence. Garrett discovered this. I confirmed it. Victor will learn it, if he hasn't already. The only thing that changes is who carries the knowledge. The only thing that endures is the voice in the woods, forever calling, forever learning, forever trying to sound human enough to come inside. I wake some mornings to the sound of my own voice on the radio, leaving messages I don't remember recording. Mostly I ignore them. Mostly I've accepted this is the price of knowing. The thing at Stone Lake isn't satisfied with wilderness. It extends its reach slowly, patiently, using the voices of people it encountered there. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself practicing different voices in the mirror, wondering which one it will steal from me first. My name is Dakota, and I've been a park ranger for 12 years across 3 different national parks. When the permanent position opened up at Glacier in the remote sector near Bowman Lake, I applied immediately. People asked me why I wanted such an isolated assignment, what I was running from or running toward. The truth was simpler and more complicated than either option. I grew up in the shadow of mountains, my grandmother's house built on land that her great-grandfather protected before any government agency existed to formalize that work. My family had been stewards of wilderness long before anyone gave us a title for it. When I was 7, my grandmother showed me how to read the seasons and the behavior of animals, how to understand that every disturbance in a forest meant something had changed. She taught me that the land tells stories if you listen carefully enough. I spent 20 years not listening. I left for university, worked in cities, tried to be something other than what my grandmother had suggested I might become. But at 34, after a decade of watching hikers disappear into the backcountry of Yosemite and Yellowstone, people I'd trained to find and return, I understood something fundamental. The wilderness doesn't care about your credentials or your experience. It has its own logic, and the most competent rangers are the ones who accept that some aspects of that logic remain forever beyond our understanding. The Glacier position was remote enough that the job posting barely attracted 20 applicants. Most rangers prefer the busier parks where there are more colleagues, better infrastructure, clearer boundaries between work and home. The cabin assignment near Bowman Lake came with a catch. I would be responsible for a territory the size of a small town, conducting patrols alone most months, managing backcountry permits, rescue operations, and resource monitoring with minimal backup. The nearest ranger station was 40 miles away via a mountain pass that closed for 5 months in winter. I drove to the site in late August, my truck loaded with supplies and equipment. The cabin had been recently renovated, though renovated meant a new stove and running water that worked on most days. It sat on a slope overlooking the lake, pine trees pressing in on 3 sides, the 4th side open to water that reflected the mountains like a mirror designed to show you what you looked like when fear began to change your face. On that first evening, I walked the perimeter, noting the recent bear activity, the marked trails, the communication equipment that would allow me to reach the main station if the weather cooperated. The silence was complete in a way that cities never allow. There were sounds, the wind, the water, the constant small movements of the forest, but underneath all of it was a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. I understood then why the position had been available so long. Not because of difficulty, though it was difficult, but because most people can't live with this kind of isolation and not begin to make up conversations with themselves. They can't be this alone without the loneliness taking on a physical weight. I thought I was different. I was wrong about that. For the first 3 weeks, the work was straightforward. Patrols of the backcountry, permit checks with hikers at trailheads, maintenance of the communication system and equipment. I documented wildlife activity, collected water samples, repaired sections of the trail that had washed out during the spring melt. I spoke to maybe 5 people in person during those first weeks. The rest of the contact came through radio checks with the main station, brief professional exchanges that became my only human conversation. The cabin remained cold even when I kept the fire going. It was the kind of cold that comes from deep stone and old wood, a cold that heat never quite reached. I moved through the rooms understanding that someone else had lived here. Someone else had sat in these chairs looking out at this lake and perhaps felt the same gradual dissolution of the usual barriers between thinking and not thinking. In the 4th week, I heard the voice. It came while I was on a patrol near the eastern edge of the territory, moving through a series of ridge passes that looked down on the valley below. I was alone in the forest, something I'd become accustomed to, when I heard my name called from the trees, not shouted but spoken in a clear voice. The kind of voice a friend would use if they'd found you after searching. The sound came from approximately 40 meters away, obscured by the tree cover. My immediate thought was that a hiker had strayed from the marked trails, possibly in trouble. Protocol demanded I head toward the sound. I did. I called back, moving between the pines, identifying myself as a ranger. The forest here was dense enough that visibility dropped to maybe 20 meters. I moved carefully, aware of uneven ground and deadfall. The voice had stopped. I called again. Then I heard it. Clearly, my own voice, repeating back my name as if I'd just called it. I stopped walking. In the wilderness, there are acoustic phenomena, sound waves bouncing off rock formations, creating echoes that seem to come from impossible places. It happens, the sound reflected and strange. I waited a full minute listening to the forest settle. Then I continued my patrol, noting the location and making a mental record to check if there had been any reported incidents in that area. For a week, nothing else happened. The incident became one of those small anomalies that rangers file away without discussion, the kind of thing that doesn't fit normal categories so you don't waste energy thinking about it. Then I heard it again, but different. I was in the cabin one evening when the radio crackled with a message from my predecessor, a ranger named Veron, who had taken a position 30 miles north. We did weekly check-ins, professional and brief, but in this transmission I heard something in the background of his communication, a sound like static or wind, and underneath it, a voice that sounded like mine, saying things I hadn't said. When I asked him about it, Veron said the radio must be picking up interference, that the weather pattern in the mountains could create unusual transmission patterns. His explanation was reasonable. I was also certain he was lying or confused about what he'd heard. As September progressed, the temperature dropped, and the forest began its transformation toward dormancy. The hikers thinned to almost nothing. The only people I encountered were technical climbers tackling the higher peaks before early snow made them inaccessible. My patrols continued, but I found myself listening differently, understanding that the silence I'd become accustomed to was not absence, but presence waiting for the right frequency to become audible. The voices came more regularly, though never with any consistency that would allow me to form a pattern or predict them. Sometimes they called my name from the forest. Sometimes they were fragments of conversations that happened to coincide with the wind patterns. Once I heard myself having an entire discussion with the lake, my voice rising from the water in a question and then answering itself like a desperate argument. I documented everything in a ranger's log, the professional habit of record keeping that gave me a framework for something that had no rational structure. The patterns I noted didn't explain anything. They only accumulated. In mid-September, I found the cottage. I was conducting a deep patrol in the western sector, an area of the territory that I'd covered only once, a region characterized by dense forest and difficult terrain. On the maps, this area was marked as belonging to Glacier, though the original survey work had been done in the 1960s and few rangers ever ventured this far from maintained trails. The cottage was not on any map I had. It was small, built of logs that had silvered to the color of old bone, the roof mostly intact, though the windows were dark. There was no clearing around it, no indication that it had ever been properly established. Trees grew near enough to the walls that their branches pressed against the wood. The door hung partially open. I should have reported it immediately, documented it, and requested instruction from the main station. Instead, I approached. The interior was a single room with a fireplace, a table, and a mattress on a wooden frame. On the table were papers, journals of some kind, but the pages had rotted in the damp and the ink had bled until no words were legible. There was a smell, something between mold and animal decay, and underneath that something else, something that made my body instinctively retreat even as my mind was gathering information. I found a name carved into the table, just initials, worn smooth with age, RC, and a date, 1984. That evening, from the cabin, I heard a voice calling my name from across the lake, using the kind of tone someone might use to call in an animal, gentle and insistent. I didn't answer. I locked the cabin doors, something I'd never done before, and I sat near the fire and I tried very hard to construct a reasonable explanation for what was happening. Rational explanations require a certain amount of evidence and consistency. What I had was accumulating strangeness, isolated incidents that didn't support a coherent narrative. This was almost worse than a clear pattern of danger would have been. The pattern would have allowed for a response. This was nothing I had been trained for. By late September, the line between what was real and what was occurring in my mind had become a theoretical distinction rather than a functional one. I was sleeping 3 hours a night, most of my time spent sitting near the radio or walking the perimeter of the cabin property, looking for something I couldn't articulate. The voices had become more sophisticated. They no longer just repeated my words, they answered questions I hadn't asked. They carried on conversations with my internal monologue, responding to thoughts rather than speech, a phenomenon that indicated either that I was experiencing a psychological break or something for which my training had not provided a name. I tried to leave. On the 23rd of September, I packed a backpack with essential supplies and began walking down the main trail toward the ranger station. The walk would take 6 hours in good conditions. I made it 4 hours before I heard my own voice, clearly and unmistakably calling from ahead on the trail. Not an echo, not a distortion. The voice of someone who sounded exactly like me, breathing like me, carrying the weight of my uncertainty in every syllable. I turned around. I walked back to the cabin. That night I listened to the lake. There were voices in it, I was certain now. Multiple voices, all approximating human speech, all speaking in registers and tones that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. They overlapped, creating something almost like a structure to the sound. An architecture of communication that existed in the margins between language and noise. I understood in that moment what the cottage meant. RC had stayed too long. Not because he'd been trapped, but because something here had learned how to trap people in the space between belief and doubt, in the place where the mind becomes its own prison. I called the ranger station on the emergency frequency. When the dispatcher answered, I gave my situation report with all the professional language I could muster. I told them I needed immediate evacuation, that the position was unsuitable, that there had been a physical emergency. I didn't mention the voices, I didn't mention the cottage. I described chest pain and dizziness, symptoms that would trigger a priority response. The dispatcher told me that a storm front was moving in, that evacuation would have to wait until morning at least. They offered to have someone stay on the radio with me overnight. I said that wouldn't be necessary. I hung up. That was when the voice came through the radio in my own tone, saying the things I hadn't said, describing the cottage and the voices with a clinical precision that made my stomach convulse. It was explaining me to me, narrating my situation with the confidence of an observer rather than a participant. I smashed the radio. In the silence that followed, I realized that destroying the radio had been a mistake. It was a choice that had narrowed my options. The nearest other human being was at minimum 30 miles away, and a storm was moving in. The roads would be closing. By morning, the weather might make evacuation impossible for several days. I was aware with perfect clarity that something here was not human. It had learned to mimic human speech by absorbing the voices of the people who had spent time in its territory. It was learning from me still, refining its understanding of human patterns, becoming more sophisticated with each day I remained. That night, I locked myself in the cabin and I did not sleep. Morning came without the storm. Instead, there was clear sky and a cold that suggested the temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees overnight. I waited until 0800 hours and then I called the ranger station. The dispatcher who answered was not familiar, a woman with a mountain accent who immediately began processing an evacuation request. She said a helicopter could reach me by midday. She asked about the nature of the emergency. I told her vehicle failure and disorientation, signs of altitude sickness. While I waited, I took inventory of the cabin. The floorboards in the back room had begun to rot, and beneath them I found a small collection of items. A watch stopped at 11:43, a wedding ring, a photograph, the image degraded past recognition but clearly showing a group of people in front of this same cabin, dated 1979. These were not belongings I'd brought with me. These belonged to someone else, to a collection of someone's stretching back decades. The helicopter arrived at 12:15 p.m. The pilot landed on a cleared space near the lake, the blade's rotation breaking the silence into something almost visible. I walked toward the aircraft with a single backpack, leaving everything else exactly as it had been. As I ducked under the rotors, I heard my name called from the forest. Not one voice now, but multiple voices, overlapping and urgent, all of them perfect approximations of my own speech, all of them calling me back. I didn't look. I climbed into the helicopter and I closed the door. I was in the air for 3 minutes before the voices started coming through the headset. The pilot cursed and tried to adjust the communication frequency. "That's strange interference," he said. I told him to ignore it. I didn't explain what he was hearing. The next 2 weeks were spent in medical evaluation and then psychological assessment. Every test indicated that I was functioning normally. There was no physiological basis for auditory hallucination. My mental state was measured as stable, showing only elevated stress levels consistent with isolation stress, nothing that indicated a break from reality. I was cleared for duty when the forestry department offered me the Glacier position again, with a promise of more frequent check-ins and a shift to a different cabin further from Bowman Lake. I declined. They offered other positions. I turned them all down. I told them I was leaving the Ranger Service. This was a lie. I couldn't leave the Ranger Service. What I did was request transfer to an urban park with high foot traffic and constant human presence. I took a position at a park so developed that there were tourists and staff and lights and noise at all hours. I haven't returned to any wilderness territory. I don't camp. I don't hike beyond trails with at least 50 other people on them. But I still hear the voices sometimes, on quiet mornings when the wind moves through the trees in a particular way. They don't call my name anymore. They're learning to approximate other things, conversations I had with people I loved, arguments with people I've lost. The sound of my own thoughts spoken back to me with a clarity that suggests they're not actually thoughts at all but echoes of something I said when I was still in that forest, still in that territory. Last month I received a newspaper clipping from an anonymous source. It reported the closure of Glacier National Park's remote sectors due to unusual wildlife activity that presents risk to ranger personnel. The closure would be indefinite pending further investigation. The article mentioned that 17 people had gone missing in that region over the past 30 years, their disappearances attributed to the usual causes: exposure, falls, disorientation. It didn't mention the cottage. It didn't mention the voices. It didn't mention the fact that voices don't just disappear. They accumulate. They learn. They prepare for the next person who comes close enough to hear them, who stays long enough for the boundary between listening and being heard to become ambiguous. I'm still not sure if I left the forest. I'm not sure if any of us ever really leave it, once we've been inside long enough to understand what the silence is trying to communicate. I think about the cottage sometimes, about RC, and whoever came before and whoever will come after. And I understand that the wilderness doesn't want to trap people. It wants to keep them, not as prisoners but as part of its voice, as part of the continuous conversation it's been having with itself since before humans gave it a name. The helicopter lifted away from Bowman Lake at 12:18 p.m. on September 24th. I watched the cabin recede beneath the clouds. I watched it disappear. I told myself that some places are meant to be left behind and forgotten, that some experiences are too far outside the normal boundaries of understanding to be integrated into regular life. I'm 38 years old now. I work during the day with well-meaning hikers and tourists. I live in a noise-filled apartment where silence never lasts long enough to become heavy, and at night, when the city sounds quiet down, I turn on a radio or a television or an audiobook. Anything to fill the space, anything to remind me that human voices, unambiguous and separate from my own mind, still exist. Because I know now what the wilderness was teaching me, that a sufficiently isolated mind doesn't need external voices to become plural. It doesn't need creatures or monsters or anything beyond the pressure of time and silence to begin to speak to itself with a voice that's familiar and yet fundamentally alien. And that the worst part of the forest, the thing that makes it truly dangerous, is that once you understand this, you can never be entirely sure which voice is actually you anymore. I hear my voice in the wind sometimes, and I have stopped trying to determine whether I'm the one speaking or simply the one listening.